We have no alternative but to keep moving with determination. We've gone too far now to turn back. And in a real sense, we are moving and we cannot afford to stop because Alabama and because our nation has a date with destiny.
The year was 1965 in Selma, Alabama, a small town around 50 miles away from the capital city of Montgomery. Although black citizens slightly outnumbered whites in the city of 29,500 people, 99% of Selma's voters were white. Only 1% were African American. It was not, however, that Selma's black citizens simply weren't interested in voting. Instead, it was due to widespread intimidation tactics such as literacy tests, poll taxes, and even acts of physical violence, all meant to suppress black voters not just in Alabama, but across all southern states.
In Selma, only 2.1% of African Americans were registered to vote. The only time you could even attempt to register to vote was the first and third Mondays of each month. You had to stand in line, get a copy of the so-called literacy test, and hundreds and thousands of people would fail the so-called literacy test.
On February 18, 1965, a group of peaceful black demonstrators gathered on the steps of Zion United Methodist Church in Marion, Alabama, calmly protesting the arrest of a county official. This protest was broken up by a group of Alabama state troopers who ordered the crowd to disperse and, without warning, violently attacked the unarmed protesters. In the chaos that ensued, Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old activist, was brutally beaten by police and shot twice in the stomach. Jackson died of his wounds 8 days later at Good Samaritan Hospital in Selma, Alabama. The death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was described by Dr. Martin Luther King as a martyred hero, is often cited as a turning point in the voting rights movement in Selma. King emphasized that Jackson had fought for voting rights throughout his life and that the fight must continue on in his memory.
We made a decision to attempt to march from Selma to Montgomery, to dramatize to the nation and to the world that people of color wanted to register to vote.
And so, on March 7, 1965, the first of 3 march attempts began. Led by John Lewis, 600 civil rights marchers began their path on U.S. Highway 80, headed out of Selma and towards Montgomery, the state's capital. However, their march was brought to an early halt at the peak of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they were ordered by armed troopers to turn back or face the consequences.
And a young man walking beside me by the name of Jose William from Dr. King's organization said, "Major, give us a moment to kneel and pray." Before we can pass word back for people to kneel and pray, the major said, "Troopers, advance." And you saw these men putting on their gas masks.
On that day, which came to be known as Bloody Sunday, 17 marchers were hospitalized and 50 others were treated by medical staff for injuries inflicted by Alabama police. Footage of the incident was broadcast all over the country, leading to demonstrations of support in over 80 major U.S. cities. After this one day, this one moment, nothing would ever be the same in the fight for voting rights. Two days later, March 9, 1965, In the aftermath of Bloody Sunday, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King led a group of 2,500 marchers out to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Although he was committed to the cause of marching to Montgomery, a court order was passed by local officials shortly after the first march, temporarily preventing the group from fulfilling their dream. Instead, Dr. King held a short prayer session and the group dispersed and returned back to Selma. On March 15th, President Lyndon B. Johnson introduced a revolutionary voting rights bill in a joint session of Congress. In a national broadcast, he publicly commended the fight for voting rights in Selma and praised the African American activists who were part of the movement.
Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
But that was not the end. There was still a third march on the horizon, and on March 20th, LBJ enlisted the Alabama National Guard to escort and protect the marchers on their path to Montgomery. The next day, only 2 weeks after Bloody Sunday, 8,000 marchers gathered at Brown Chapel AME Church, including religious officials, black activists, and white allies, all prepared to complete the 54-mile trek to the state's capital.
They told us we wouldn't get here. There were those who said that we would get here only over their dead bodies. Well, all the world today knows that we are here and we are standing before the forces of power in the state of Alabama saying we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around. That's right.
One afternoon, 50 years ago, so much of our turbulent history, the stain of slavery and anguish of civil war, the yoke of segregation and tyranny of Jim Crow, the death of 4 little girls in Birmingham, the dream of a Baptist preacher, all that history met on this bridge.
It's been 55 years now since the group, which ultimately grew to 25,000 people over the 5-day march, stepped foot in Montgomery. It's been 55 years since the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, banning the use of literacy tests and poll taxes. It's been 55 years since a movement that started with a small group of Selma citizens led to a major change in the American system, and ultimately brought voter equality to an entire nation.
Till it fall, we're gonna stay here till it fall in Selma, Alabama.
Build that wall, hey, they that build that wall in Selma, Alabama. Love is the thing that make it fall,